Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings. Can you picture it? The disciples leaving the temple with Jesus in awe of the greatness of the buildings and the sheer size of the entire Temple Mount. Located atop Jerusalem's northeastern ridge, it occupied about a sixth of the city's area, about 1.5 million square feet, or about 26 football fields. Its foundational walls, they were made of gigantic stones, the largest being about 45 feet long, 11 and a half feet high, and 12 feet thick. Think of a huge shipping container and then add on to that. Stones upon stones upon stones. Immovable, strong, mighty, all the things you want when it comes to what was believed to be the most important place in the life of the faithful at the time. Only Jesus had been calling out the ways that those with authority were running the show. The way many had been using their positions of power for personal gain. The entanglement of religious and political systems that fostered oppression. And the outright dismissal of the responsibility to care for others. But that would all change, right? That would all change with Jesus. And the disciples, well, they were positioned right alongside him. I can't help but wonder if, as the disciples look around with wide-eyed wonder, if they're imagining themselves setting up shop in the temple. If they're looking at the large buildings and picturing their corner office with a view. Figuring that with Jesus, somehow things would get back to normal, back on course. And that soon enough, they'd be there with him, his board of directors. Only Jesus tells his disciples that the buildings that seem so great to them will crumble. They will all be thrown down. So much for the corner office. Later, while sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, a few of the disciples pulled Jesus aside and asked him, "When is this all going to happen? When is the temple going to crumble? And what should they be on the lookout for?" Instead of giving them a date to circle on their calendars, Jesus talks of impostors, wars, and more destruction. That somehow all of this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Yes, things were going to change with Jesus, but it wasn't going to happen in the ivory tower. It was going to happen in the rubble. And that's the hard pill to swallow then and now. Because nobody wants to be there among the ruins. The ruins of our environment, of our society, of our families, of our hearts. It's just too painful to sift through the rubble and face what we find there. The consequences of greed, the shrapnel of dominance, the disillusionment of perfection, and the deep, deep disappointment of how we thought it would be. No one wants to dive into this kaleidoscope of dismay. But this is precisely where God shows up. God in Jesus shows up amid the complexity and distress of life and sifts through the rubble, making sure that no one is forgotten or overlooked. One of Jesus' very first teachings, his first public sermon, is all about this. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. This blessedness is the gift of God's grace, and Jesus is at work uncovering the places it's been buried in ourselves, in our communities, and in the world around us. And he is inviting us to become living stones that are remembered in him. Living stones placed together to build up mercy and compassion, humility and kindness, generosity and peace. At a celebration of confirmation some years ago in a church I used to serve in up north, now acting primate of the Anglican Church of Canada, Archbishop Anne Germond, who was our bishop, spoke about becoming living stones. To help get her point across, she gave everyone a stone as they entered the church. During her sermon, she invited the youth who were being confirmed to gather up the stones from everyone, and then in the chancel, similar to a space where I'm standing right now, use the stones to make a symbol that represented what becoming living stones looked like to them. Now remember, this wasn't scripted, and we weren't quite sure what the youth were going to do with the stones. They worked quietly, huddled together, kneeling on the floor, moving around about 100 of these stones. When they had finished and stepped back, we saw that they had arranged the stones on the ground, side by side, into the shape of a large heart. And inside the heart, a cross. Every stone was used, all at the same level, none atop of another. At our best, this is what learning to follow Jesus looks like. Becoming living stones, compassionately working together, trusting that Jesus is in it with us, even in, or perhaps especially in, the places of brokenness. Recognizing that new life begins in the rubble, and that we have a role to play here, which begins with seeing one another and all of creation as Jesus would have us see, through eyes of love and care, as opposed to fear or retaliation, apathy or ignorance. Only we have short memories, and we start to build the stones, one atop the other, in an effort to be self-sustaining, strong, and mighty. And when the stones are standing on top of one another, They may look impressive, but anyone who's ever played Jenga knows how hard it is to keep things balanced as part of the tower is taken away. The only way to ensure that the structure comes down without a loud crash and pieces everywhere is to dismantle it piece by piece from the top down. And that's not how we've been playing the game. We still think that the view from the top is where it's at. And while we may pull out pieces here and there, what we're really doing is desperately trying to keep the structure intact, thinking it'll keep us safe. But if Jesus is down there in the rubble, what are we doing trying to stay way up here? The good news is that God doesn't give up on us. God continues to call us by name over and over and over, forgiving us and loving us. What then might it look like to let go of the illusion of grandeur, to let go of false pretense, and know that we will not be forgotten? To allow Jesus to find us among the rubble and reveal to us what it looks like to be living stones. Perhaps a bit like a people gathered knowing we don't have it all figured out, but we're willing to not look away and keep on asking questions. Maybe a table where bread is broken and wine is poured out and shared with all, a foretaste of what's to come. And an open door where we join Jesus in the digging, who is birthing something new out of what looks like death. A heart with a cross in the center, made of living stones.